Former United Nations Secretary General Kofi Annan is given a state funeral and burial in his birthplace, Ghana, on September the 13th. Last month, Kofi Annan died at the age of 80 in Switzerland after a short illness. Tributes have been pouring from around the world, particularly from world leaders and politicians, mourning Annan's passing. Looking back on his whole life, how did he pursue a more peaceful and equal world? What were his most important contributions to the United Nations and the world? And how can we be enlightened by him today? To honor this consummate diplomat and global statesman, I'm joined in the Beijing studio by Zahara Beatty, China Director of Development Reimagined, Victor Gao Zhikai, Vice President of Center for China and Globalization, or CCG, and the current affairs commentator Anna Tangen. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. Welcome to Dialogue.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Nobody is surprised that Kofi Annan is given a state funeral in his own hometown, his birthplace, Ghana. But what do you think of his contributions to the United Nations that merit the unprecedented tributes that are pouring in from around the world?
We mourn the death of Mr. Kofi Annan. He is truly an outstanding statesman. He's an outstanding citizen of Ghana, but also he is truly an outstanding representative of Africa as a whole.
In a word, he's the symbol of national pride for Ghana and for the whole sub-Saharan region.
Absolutely. And during his 10 years as the General Secretary of the United Nations, overall, I think he played a very steady hand in navigating through very complicated international situation, and he deserved a lot of comment and respect by the world leaders as we witnessed the pouring in of all these letters of condolences for his passing away. And as the General Secretary for 10 years of the United Nations, he did a great deal of service for the world, for mankind as a whole, and we mourn him, and we really feel very sorry for this great loss.
Kofi Annan deserves credit for enormous contributions to the reconstruction of the United Nations in many ways, but so long as we are concerned, some of the Secretaries Generals of the United Nations came from a humble cultural and national background, like developing countries. Dr. Boutros-Ghali and Kofi Annan himself, the first of his kind from the sub-Saharan region. What do you think of the image and legacy of Kofi Annan for people in your country, Ghana?
Sure. In parts of Africa, he's referred to as a tall Iroko tree, which means that he stands tall, he leads the way, and he's a symbol for many of us. And honestly, as a young student in Ghana, knowing that there was another Ghanaian, Mr. Kofi Annan, at the helm of world leadership in the UN was something that was deeply inspiring for me. It heavily influenced my academic choices. It led me to study global affairs at Yale. But importantly, it gave me a sense of hope that with such representation, it was possible for people like myself to one day be at international institutions and making a change. And so I think for many Ghanaians and many Africans, as well as for many people who are often not represented in these global forums, Mr. Kofi Annan's image was one that inspired. And personally, I know for myself and many others, we mourn the loss of Mr. Kofi Annan. I
was lucky enough and privileged to interview him 3 years ago in Beijing when he came to visit. By the way, he paid 7 visits to China, and more often after he retired from the post of Secretary General. Now, Anna, I wonder if you are totally overwhelmed by the glow of his image, or you will remain level-headed as to the vulnerabilities of a human individual like Kofi Annan. He's no exception. He made mistakes. When we review his legacy, what are the things that impressed you most?
Well, actually, the thing that most impressed me about him was his final speech to the UN, when he laid out what we're experiencing today, this kind of diaspora of ideas. Instead of having institutions that are strong, he was credited for creating the International Criminal Court. Now, just
which the United States
has come out and said
John Bolton made it very clear that any of the Americans brought to the justice in ICC, the United States to punish this country.
Yeah, but John Bolton is a possible candidate for inclusion at the ICC as a war criminal because of his previous actions. So I can understand his point of view, but the fact that it would be brought out. But he talked about this kind of drift away from institution and ideas towards a kind of brutality of just pure strongman politics and things like this, and talking about creating institutions. I would say this, though. I don't know that he would have gotten the Nobel Prize, which he shared with the UN in 2001, if it had been at the end. I think his work on the Elders Program and the work that he performed in creating these institutional values for health, education, business, okay, and the environment. I think these were all important things that he did. I mean, no one is without blame. If we look back on our lives, there's always things that we should have done. Obviously, Rwanda and Bosnia are two areas where it was perhaps he himself admitted he wished he had done it differently and perhaps better.
By the end of one's life, everyone has his or her regrets. What do you think of the list of regrets for Kofi Annan? He himself said he failed to prevent the Iraq War. But what do you think of the reasons behind his incapability?
First of all, I have a very high personal admiration for Kofi Annan. Yes, indeed, during his 10 years as the Secretary General of the United Nations, not everything he wanted to do was delivered or achieved. But this is, in my judgment, more due to the fact that as the General Secretary of the United Nations, you do not have a free hand in making all these major decisions. You really need to navigate.
Are you suggesting quietly that the United Nations has remained a talking shop?
No.
Without the ability to execute the missions?
No. What I mean is that the United Nations as a whole and the Secretary General also in particular need to navigate very closely among the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, first of all, and liaising and consulting with all the members of the United Nations General Assembly. This is indeed a very, very important task, but also in many cases it's a mission impossible. And therefore, as the General Secretary or as the Secretary General of the United Nations, on many occasions your hands are very much tied, and despite of all your aspirations and your willingness and commitment to do the right thing, sometimes there is a gridlock among the major powers, and you cannot have a free hand in delivering what you originally wanted to do. That's
when we go back to review some chapters of the Cold War, it comes as no surprise that the United Nations became a platform for the sumo wrestling between the two superpowers, the former Soviet Union and the United States. Look at the vetoes that the Soviets exercised so many times to reject whatever that came from the other side of the world, namely the Western Hemisphere that the United States represented during those days. What do you think of the inability that Kofi Annan was facing?
Well, I think the speech that was referred to, where he spoke about the importance of us not drifting away from multilateralism, shows the work that he did do to try and promote a UN system that represented the interests of all the world stakeholders. Nonetheless, he was facing, as Mr. Gao mentioned, a really difficult situation where you had the U.S. in some instances refusing to abide by the charters of the UN. The Iraq War is the most pertinent example. And so I think what Mr. Kofi Annan tried to do, however, was try to push through changes that would allow for the system to be stronger. So an example would be the responsibility to protect. He realized with the failure of both Bosnia and Rwanda that the system did not allow for the UN to act in the interest of those who were most unable to speak for themselves. And so while it was a personal failure from him, on his end, I think that the beauty of Mr. Annan, or what I admire, was that he took that failure and used it to create a stronger institution in the hopes to improve the UN to be a more effective multilateral organization.
What do you think of the conflicts between principles that were held so dear by Kofi Annan and his colleagues in the United Nations, and the dilemma that he could not have a free hand, as Victor Gao pointed out earlier.
Well, it wasn't always just a free hand in these things. I know that he was under a tremendous amount of pressure, but there were instances. I mean, there was a number of complaints against the head of the UN Refugee Committee. 4 women stood up and said that he had harassed them. He protected them. And there was the oil for food situation involving his son. There's also the issue of the peacekeepers themselves, which in a number of countries were exchanging basically favors and protection for sex.
And there were also stories about sexual abuse.
But my point is that we think of the UN as a very mature institution, but the fact is when he took it over, it did not have the same kind of structures that you would have within a government. It wasn't the kind of checks and balances system. He inherited basically a country club that was run predominantly by the 5 members, the Security Council.
P5,
they dominated
the
P5. They
Council.
Dominated. The rest of the countries kind of watched. You remember, this is just coming off the Cold War period when it was just vetoes by the Soviets, as you pointed out, and U.S. saying you should do this, that, and the other thing. So it was a very different institution. I think, ironically, he did move it from where it was, this kind of country club, to more of an international institution. Ironically, though, we're seeing the unraveling of the United Nations in danger of becoming a talk shop, simply because the people at the top of it are no longer interested in talking. They're firing salvos of tariffs. They're saying that it's me. I mean, can you imagine Woodrow Wilson, the founder, saying to the world, "Oh, America first. We're going to find this, create this group of people who are going to support America being first." I mean, this is antithetical to everything that has led up to this period, and ironically, what created the wealth and substance and soft power of the U.S. So, unfortunately, as we sit here today, his legacy is literally unraveling.
Putting America first is, of course, a doctrine shared by President Wilson and his successors in the White House. Having said this, from Horn of Africa at the height of the Cold War to Syria, the war-torn country in the Middle East, we saw proxy wars, and therefore that's the major point where he could do nothing, basically, either in the capacity of the Secretary General or Special Envoy of the UN Security Council. Today, in the wake of the Cold War, not necessarily today in the stricter sense, but the United Nations Security Council would have to reconsider their mandate, which is supposed to be 2 major themes. One is development, the other peace. Now, with the end of the Cold War, what do you think of the mission of poverty reduction, namely Millennium Development Goal that was first put forward by Kofi Annan?
I think that's a very important goal, and we are still not yet fully fulfilling that goal. It's a pity. And as on the security side, I think the United Nations really, for it to become more effective, need to line up the consensus view of all the P5 and also the majority view of all the memberships. And on many occasions, it is very difficult to achieve this. If any one of the P5 veto any resolution, the United Nations will be paralyzed, despite of all the good intentions, etc. And I think on the development
side, the United Nations
side,
may have been bypassed, but the United States would send its own troops to Iraq, for example. That's a situation where Kofi Annan expressed his deepest regret when he came back to review the unfortunate legacy of his career as the Secretary General in the United Nations.
Absolutely.
He failed to prevent the war.
Absolutely. I think as a rule of principle, no country should be allowed to put itself above the United Nations. The United Nations should be the most and the highest ranking power of authority in terms of international security issues. But the United States is not doing that. The United States has the tendency, especially under President Donald Trump, to put itself above the United Nations and disregard the authority of the United Nations when it chooses to do that. And this is a peril for world peace in the world today.
Well, before we elaborate the dilemma of a conflict between peace and development, let me brief you very quickly yet another conflicting idea that has obsessed all of the top diplomats at the United Nations. The doctrine that the United Nations is entrusted with is, first of all, it attempts to square a circle. Since its founding, the United Nations has embodied two rival conceptions of world order. On the one hand, there is the Westphalian notion that the sovereign state is the primary barrier of rights and responsibilities in international affairs. The other, I'm afraid, is the importance of human rights. And that's made very clear in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But both are embodied deeply and clearly in the UN Charter. So I wonder if Anna and Zahra agree with me. This is yet another major point that has failed Kofi Annan.
If I could quickly add on the point around poverty and development or peace, poverty reduction and peace. For me, the two can be separated. In Kofi Annan's efforts to counter terrorism, one of the things he mentioned was 5 Ds, and one of the Ds was to dissuade disenfranchised people to joining terrorist organizations. Because the truth is, when people are disenfranchised, there is a higher propensity to be drawn to more radical or extreme movements. And so that is a conflict, these two ideas, that really needs to be reconciled. In order to ensure peace, you really do have to ensure that people are equipped.
And fully employed.
And employed, have options, have choice, have ability to exercise agency. Exactly. With the second point that you've raised, it is a very dicey issue because the UN does seek to maintain the idea of sovereignty. However, protecting human rights is also at the core of the UN. It's why it was founded post-World War II also, because there was a clear recognition that failing to ensure the human rights of people could result in the sort of atrocities we saw during World War II, the Holocaust, and then later on we saw it repeat itself again and again with Rwanda, with Srebrenica, even more recently in Syria. And so I think the UN, increasingly, as we realize that these conflicts are not going away, does need to work harder towards effectively addressing human rights abuses where they occur, and also ensuring that members of the P5, the US, UK, for example, in their efforts to counter terrorism, do not abuse human rights. And I think the UN, Kofi Annan did a good job of criticizing the US and UK for abusing human rights in their fight against terrorism.
I just want to add one point, and that is you start out with the definition of the Westphalian system. The Westphalia was all about the exhaustion of these powers who had battled over issues they could not reconcile.
Through war.
Through war. They literally got to the point where they wouldn't even talk to each other, but they couldn't go on. They couldn't keep fighting. So this idea that the nation state is the only way of doing this and that there's only one definition for human rights is perhaps a little bit narrow. When you start talking about nation states in Asia, they have different definitions. There they would emphasize that it's the duty of the government to keep civil order, to ensure that there are jobs, opportunity, that there's no civil disruption, that the individual is not above the state, but below the state, that the good of the all takes precedence over the good of an individual. So these competing visions of what we see now is often rooted in definitions that were adopted. I mean, it was a Western organization. Of course it adopted Western ideas about how these things should be defined. But I think it's dangerous if you do want to have an inclusive world to not say at least that there are other definitions which are equally valid.
President Woodrow Wilson does deserve credit and commands respect for building the United Nations in the wake of the First World War on notions of what we call the Wilsonian doctrine, Wilsonianism. Namely, that's the representation of idealism, but we cannot forget the ugly realities of power politics in the wake of the Second World War. But you are watching Dialogue with Victor Gaujikai, Zahra Beatty, and Anna Tangen. We are discussing the legacies and regrets of Mr. Kofi Annan, the late Secretary General of the United Nations. The state funeral in his home country was held on Thursday. Stay with us, we'll be right back. Welcome back. Now let's look at the relationship between Mr. Kofi Annan and China. As I said earlier in the first part of the interview, he came to China 7 times, and he came more often to this country after he had retired from the post of Secretary General. Obviously there were debates between China and the United Nations that he represented. during the 10 years. So what do you think of his image and our perception of Kofi Annan?
Well, first of all, China attaches great importance to the United Nations as a whole, as a political system. Secondly, China really has the highest level of admiration and respect for Mr. Kofi Annan, despite of the fact that China may not fully agree with some of his initiatives. China really respected him as the top leader of the United Nations, and especially after his retirement, I think the relations between Kofi Annan and China and many institutions here in China have been very good. He has many friends here in Beijing, in other major cities in China, and we look at him not only as the former Secretary General of the United Nations, but truly as an outstanding representative of Africa, as well as an outstanding spokesperson of Ghana. So I think we truly mourn his loss, his passing away, and we wish his soul rest in peace. And we hope his legacy will survive, and China can continue to benefit from his wisdom and many of his guidances
Too many
he provided to us.
Say he's a man of a vision, principles, integrity, and he is respected by a majority of the Chinese, despite our differences. Up next, let's take a quick look at some of the highlights of my interview that I conducted 3 years ago with this man.
China today is a major economic power. Asia is the fastest growing region, with 50% of the world's population. You cannot ignore these facts. And if you are looking at the global, then when they talked of the new world order, I think they were looking at it in terms of countries embracing democracy, human rights, and to some extent, as they saw it, the Western way of life. But that was the 1990s. Today we have a different situation, as I've indicated, with tectonic shifts moving towards Asia, and the world has to adjust to this. And this is where I believe adapting the global mechanism for managing our affairs becomes necessary. You cannot ignore the emergence of countries like China, India, Brazil, South Africa, Indonesia. They all need a voice and want a voice at the table. And if you want cooperation, you have to give them a meaningful participation. And if you don't, you're going to get possibly even destructive competition.
Yes, indeed. Voices of the emerging markets need to be respected. And he did spoke of the tectonic shifts of affluence and influence from the west to the east in the wake of the Cold War, with China being in the forefront as a powerful symbol. Having said this, now, cultural differences aside, our understanding about human rights aside at this moment, what do you think of the implications of Millennium Development Goal? China's presence in Africa is formidable. Okay, look at the 10-point proposal that President Xi Jinping raised in Johannesburg 3 years ago, and this time around at the FOCAC summit in Beijing, he emphasized again the overwhelming tasks and commitments that China has for the development of the Sub-Sahara region, in particular in Africa. So what do you think of, first of all, the immense, the unprecedented scale of poverty alleviation in China over the past 4 decades since our opening up? We were able to lift 800 million out of poverty in China, and we go to Africa and we invest heavily in infrastructure and the industrialization of Africa. Now, we are responding to the appeal from Kofi Annan, namely development or poverty reduction in Africa, one of the major underdeveloped continents in the world.
So Mr. Kofi Annan, when he addressed Peking University in 2015, talked about the need for China and Africa to continue to collaborate, but to ensure that it's mutually beneficial. And I think that China's reduction in poverty gives Africa a lot of opportunity to learn from China and to partner with China. indeed, the opportunities for Africa to benefit from China's engagements are endless. However, I think that the Millennium Development Goals here are important because they provide somewhat of a guide as to how some of that investment coming in or the grants coming in should be used. It allows African citizenry to hold their countries more accountable. Some argue that MDGs were too narrow. They provided a focal point, but perhaps they were too narrow in some regard, without enough focus on the environment, for example. So the new SDGs, which are slightly more broader, do give a good way for African civil society, African governments to ensure that their country development plans take into account not just the need to create employment, so industrialize, but to think long term and avoid some of the issues that we see here in China today with rapid urbanization, with rapid industrialization, some of the effects of that, pollution, etc. And so I think Africa has a lot to learn from China, both in terms of China's experience of industrialization and how to use secondary economic zones, industrial parks, but also importantly, how to avoid some of China's mistakes. And so in that partnership, I think it's important for African governments, African actors to really think critically about what we want from China, how we want to engage, and which aspects of China's experience are most relevant to us.
The last question, very quickly, from each of you, I'd like to have your comments. The charisma of Kofi Annan. Now, we're talking about the state funeral and what kind of inspirations we can draw from this iconic figure of the United Nations.
Well, I think Kofi Annan is a man of reason, a man of great wisdom, a man of courage, and I think a man of great rationality. And I think he managed the affairs of the United Nations in a very sober-minded way. He did not appear to be beholden to any major power, for example, and he managed to stand on top of the hill. And he had a vision for the world, and he did his best in making the best contribution to the United Nations and to mankind. In this spirit, we owe him a lot of gratitude.
Now the voice from the Queen of Africa.
Far from the Queen. Kofi Annan was a great statesman, but above all, he was a man. And I think he reflects, for all of us, what one can achieve. The successes, he carried himself with pride, he carried himself with grace. Yeah, he had his failings, but importantly, he acknowledged some of those failings. He rose up again. And I think there's a proverb that says, you don't judge a man by how many times he falls, but how many times he stands up. And we cannot deny some of his failings. But I think, for me, the lesson I take from him, as someone who comes from a continent where we often criticize our leaders, is that although he had his shortcomings, in many ways he tried to chart a way forward. He tried to make a better path, not just for himself, but for others who might work in his stead.
You know, Zahra, your voice of conscience reminds me of a punchline that I like so much. No one stands taller than those who stand corrected. Anna.
Okay. I would say a diplomat, negotiator, strategist. He's somebody who grew up within the bureaucracy and then became a statesman. I respect especially his final words to the world when he resigned, and also all the deeds he accomplished afterwards through his foundation and the Council of Elders.
Thank you so much for your participation and your voices on the image of Kofi Annan and the legacy he has left behind. Obviously, Antonio Guterres, his successor, has a lot to do. Well, it depends on whether the United States is happy or not. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.